First time I saw Prabhupada was in Dallas. I went to Dallas with Atulananda, who was a friend of mine who became a devotee. And I had been corresponding with Srila Prabhupada for about a year and had done some service for him. He'd asked me to help buy the temple in Hawaii. And been reading the books and chanting, following the principles. And so he was in Dallas, and I flew to Dallas to meet him. And I was like very nervous, you know, because I thought, here's this great man, you know, great spiritual personality. And Bali Mardan picked me up at the airport, and he at that point was married to the supposedly Toyota woman, you know. So they took me to the Dallas temple to meet Srila Prabhupada. And when I came in, I offered my obeisances, you know, and I hadn't even gotten up from offering my obeisances, and Srila Prabhupada said, so you know, in a very grave tone of voice, so you were Henry Ford's great-grandson. And I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, so where is he now, you know? And immediately, of course, my thought was, well, I don't know, you know? And, you know, so I was immediately put on the spiritual platform and was thinking about, you know, the difference between the body and the spirit. And Srila Prabhupada preached to me on that point. And another funny thing that happened during that meeting was Bali Mardan's wife came in, you know, at some point during the meeting. And Prabhupada looked at her, you know, she offered her obeisances, and he looked at her and then looked at me and said, she is Toyota. and then he had a chuckle. He thought that was pretty funny, you know. So that was the first time I met him. And you know, I was impressed not only by his, you know, by the grandeur of his presence, but also he was so personable. You know, as soon as I started talking to him, he made me feel very comfortable. And he was always like that, always interested personally in how you were feeling, how you were doing, you know, how was your health, and made you feel comfortable no matter who you were. It was really nice.
I had been involved with many different gurus and yogis, and I had taken initiation from different spiritual masters. But the interesting thing is that I had met one spiritual master who taught me for about almost 3.5 years. But he always told me that he was not my guru. So one day, I took initiation from Sri Chinmoy. And then I came back and saw this previous teacher. And I mentioned how I found my guru now. He's given me initiation, and he explains and says that he is a Jagat Guru. So this first teacher kind of laughed. And he said, he's only a Mayavadi. And then he began to explain what Mayavadism is and personalism. And he went on to say, do you really want to know who the Jagat Guru is? Now, by now, he had let me know that that meant a very highly evolved spiritual teacher, a teacher of teachers. And so he paused, and then he asked me again. He said, do you really want to know? And by the time I was getting a little nervous, but I was more curious. And so then he asked the third time. He says, do you really want to know? And I says, yes. And he said, Srila Prabhupada, the spiritual master of the Hare Krishna movement. Now, during these 3.5 years where he was previously teaching me, every now and then, and he was teaching me what's called Raja Yoga and Astanga Yoga, a lot of kind of metaphysical things. But he would always say, I'm not your guru. But every now and then he would say something or explain something, but he would say, but Prabhupada says like this, or Prabhupada has done like this. And I thought Prabhupada was maybe his uncle or some friend of his. And so when he mentioned that name again, it rang a bell. And he says, you know, when he told me that Srila Prabhupada, the spiritual master of the Hare Krishna movement, I was devastated. Because I had saw the devotees 2 different times. And I thought they were very weird, unusual. And I was thinking, you mean those people who wear the bed sheets? Who put war paint on their face and go around jumping down in the streets with tennis shoes on and mismatched socks? You mean they are connected with something that is very advanced, very high? He said their spiritual master is a spiritual master of spiritual masters, and they have the higher knowledge on the planet. And now it was really bewildering, because here I've been with this person for 3.5 years. He was a tremendous mystic. He read minds, and he had all kind of powers and shaktis. And he had never cheated me or disappointed me, and he always told me that he wasn't my guru. So I had, I was in a dilemma. So I decided I would go and explore with the idea that I was really trying to prove to myself that for some reason he's lied to me. So I got as many books as I could from the devotees. And I went to visit the temple in New York, and I would go and hear Bhagavad Gita class. I would go and hear the devotees talk, just to find fault. But the more that I studied the books, the more I became convinced. And as I talked to devotees, I saw there's all different types of devotees. And some are serious, some are less serious. And I saw that there were some problems, but I realized those who are following are very special, and the philosophy was very special. So then after that, I came back to him at some point, because after studying like that for 6 months, then I decided to join. And I joined. I went to Dallas to help Satsu Maharaj in the Gurukula. But now once, a couple of years later, I saw that same teacher. And I wanted to ask him some questions, and ask him a few questions. And he became furious, very furious. He said, "You have met the spiritual master of the universe. And now you're coming back to me, asking me questions." He said, "You're not going to get me to make offenses to such great soul." He said, when Srila Prabhupada came to America, there were many, and these are his words, spiritual teachers who knew of his calling and who should have assisted him. He said, "I stopped teaching when Prabhupada came to America." Then he began to explain, "I taught you all of these things because I saw you were so entangled, so interested in such things, and I realized that this would help you in your service for Prabhupada in the future." He said, "Now, you leave here and don't you ever come back again."
One time we were driving from Calcutta to Mayapur, and Gargamuni was driving, and I was sitting in the front seat. I always used to talk. I talk with Gargamuni. We're friends, so I talk, and Prabhupada would say, "Stop talking." But anyway, somehow or other, just inadvertently start talking, and sure enough, Gargamuni, was driving, and he was talking to me, and he hit a farmer while he was driving, and the guy went down on his bicycle, and that was it. And immediately, Gargamuni stopped the car, backed up, and all the farmers ran over and stuck their picks right against the tires, and they started screaming. So Prabhupada was right leaning out the window and looking at the guy, and he started talking to one of the farmers. And then after about 10 minutes, Prabhupada said, "Give him 5 rupees. He reached and he gave him 5 rupees. He said, "Drive." And they took the picks away, and we drove away. We looked back, the guy was still. Prabhupada was an expert, Of course, I didn't talk after that. I didn't say a word after that.
I originally began to learn Sanskrit on my own in the Montreal temple through the kindness of some Indians who used to come and take lunch with us. 3 gentlemen used to come and pay a little money and take their prasad with us. And so every time they came, I'd ask them about the letters. How do you write this? How do you like that? And one of them brought a little grammar book for me, and I began to learn Devanagari. And then during the summer of 1967, let's go back a little. Prabhupada took sick in the summer of '67, spring and summer of '67, and just before he was to go back to India, he came first to New York, and naturally everyone came down to see him. And it so happened that Achyutananda and I went out to a bookstore called Orientalia, which was it's now closed, but at that time was, along with Wiser's, it was probably the best bookstore in New York on Oriental philosophy. So anyway, we were poking around, and we found a book there called the Brahma Samhita, Sri Brahma Samhita, and it had a picture of Bhakti Siddhanta in the front. It was published by Bhakti Vilas Tirtha and the Chaitanya Mutt. So I thought, well, this looks like the same teachings. So we purchased it and we brought it back. We went back to 26 Second Avenue. And Prabhupada this time was very weak, and he was sitting in his room most of the time, and people were trying to keep away from him. That was the policy, to let him rest. But we went in and paid our obeisances, and Jutanand and I gave him this book and said, Prabhupada, we found this in the bookstore. Is this bona fide? Prabhupada picks it up and he opens, he says, my Guru Maharaj. Yes, and he said, I said, Prabhupada, is it bona fide? He said, this book, he said, I had by heart, this book, Brahma Samhita, and it was done especially by my Guru Maharaj. And I said, well, can we read it? And he said, oh yes, very good book to read. Now, in any case, that particular edition of Brahma Samhita had the Sanskrit in Devanagari characters, and then the translation, and then the purport in English. But it had no transliteration. And later during the summer, people were singing the Govindam prayers. And it was hard to hear the words sometimes in the song. And when that came out, the tapes of that came out, I thought, well, I have this, it was in my possession later in Montreal. And this was the Brahma Samhita in the society. And I had it in front of me, and so I thought, well, maybe I can, since I had learned the transliteration, maybe I transliterate this. So I began to transliterate this, and I did perhaps half the thing or something like that. And then I sent it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada wrote me back a very extraordinary letter and said, well, this is wonderful. I've made copies of this for all our devotees to use. Please complete doing this, and you can do great service for the society if you can do more work like this. So that was the beginning.
I don't remember much about the initiation ceremony because I was like really nervous, I was the only one that was initiated, so I was like, in the spotlight, and I was afraid I was going to do something really stupid. So, but I remember when he gave me my name, he pronounced it Ambarish, and I didn't have a clue who that was at the time, because I was still pretty new. But the funny thing was that after the initiation, my relationship with him changed, because he was my spiritual master. And I went up after in the afternoon of the same day, I believe. And I wanted to go to the devotee restaurant in Waikiki. They had a prasadam restaurant there. So I thought I would, be the humble disciple and go ask permission to go to the restaurant. So I went up and I offered my obeisances, and I said, Srila Prabhupada, is it okay if I go to the restaurant? He said, no, we do not go to restaurants, And I thought, but this is the devotee restaurant, and so I said, but Srila Prabhupada, you don't understand. And I hadn't even gotten that out yet. And I realized, that as it was coming out, that this is not something you say to your spiritual master. And he said, no, we do not go to restaurants. So I gave up at that point and surrendered, and I didn't go, So that was pretty much the only thing I remember about the time I was initiated.
Now, the first physical encounter was also in New York. And that must have been, I guess, 1971. There was a devotee in New York named Bhakti Jana, sort of unusual devotee. And he was trying to start a program in Harlem. So Prabhupada had given him permission to do this program. So he was trying to gather, some black bodies to help him. And I was just, a bhakta coming, to visit at that point. I was still at the University of Princeton, and on weekends I would come to the temple. So I had connected with him because Prabhupada was coming in. I think there was a Rath Yatra or something. But Prabhupada was going to meet with those devotees who were going to work in Harlem. project. So we all came in for darshan. And somehow I was lucky to sit very close to Srila Prabhupada. And as everyone felt, I felt he was looking at me, you know, very piercing and very intimately. And I remember asking one question that was bothering me. See, when I would come to the temple in New York, you know, I graduated from Princeton by that time, and I was in suits, and I was working as an assistant to the public defender in New Jersey. And I was a little puffed up, you know. I graduated from this good school and had a nice job, and I was quite young. But not many devotees would preach to me. And there was probably many reasons. One, they probably saw I was puffed up. Two, they probably wasn't sure. This guy in his black body, can he really know this, understand this? And because I had been in so many different environments, you know, I was brought up in the inner city area, but I went to very, you know, sophisticated prep schools. And I was, you know, in environments where I was with, you know, senators' sons and things. Then I went to Princeton, around all these environments. So I was very sensitive to the situations. So I had this question for Srila Prabhupada. And my first question was, Srila Prabhupada, there's prejudiceness in this movement. Prabhupada looked at me, he says, oh. He said, so someone is thinking you're the body? And if you're disturbed that they're thinking that you're the body and you become disturbed, he says, then you are also nonsense. That was the spirit. So the spirit was, Prabhupada was telling me in so many words, yes, so bodily consciousness is there in so many ways. But if I'm getting so distracted because of that, then that is my nonsense.
First and second canto Bhagavatams especially Prabhupada wanted. Bhagavad Gita and first and second canto Bhagavatams. He liked the book distribution we were doing. At one point I was complaining to Prabhupada that they're not printing. We were distributing so many books with the Radha Party. I said, Prabhupada, they can't keep up with our distribution. They must. He said, all right, don't worry. They were doing 20,000 at a time. He said, I will instruct them to print 50,000. He said, but one thing is that although they can't keep up with you, you can't keep up with me because I'm 3 cantos ahead or 2 cantos ahead of you both. He said, so I'm ahead of both of you. He got into the competitive mood.
Well, I originally began, after I learned enough Sanskrit transliteration, Prabhupada gave me the manuscript of second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam to edit. It was the original, what he typed, actually, is the original typed version with some of his corrections on it. I mean, it was quite a valuable thing, but anyway, just say, here, take this manuscript and edit it. And at that time, a lot of people were editing Prabhupada's books. When I first came to Montreal, Kirtananda had a copy of the Gita manuscript, and he was working on, and I guess Hayagriva had something, and Rai Rama had something, and, you know, these were the early days of ISKCON. But anyway, he gave me the original second canto manuscript. I think that was 1967, 68. And so I began in that way doing some work for Prabhupada with editing, English editing and Sanskrit editing. And then as time went on, I began to do that work. I began to do that work in 1968. I forget what I was doing. Yes, I was doing, and I was doing second canto, and then I was doing third. Prabhupada began translating again. Second canto he'd done in India and I think in some of the part of the United States, but he'd done it on his own. He typed it on himself. And he'd stopped translating for a while. And then in 1968 he began translating again, the third canto of the Bhagavatam. And he began doing it in tape form. Earlier the Bhagavatam, he typed it out. Now for the first time he began doing it in tape. And he began sending the audio tapes, what do you call them, to Satsvarup. And at that time I was living with Satsvarup and Jadharani in the Boston Temple. There were 3 of us there basically, and when I first came also Damodar was there, and Devananda came and went. But anyway, Satsvarup began receiving the Srimad Bhagavatam. And along with that, to help. Prabhupada asked me to do the transliteration of the verses for the third canto. And he would send us, at that time, the pages from the Gita Press edition of the Srimad Bhagavatam. It had the English translation and the Sanskrit. And I would just transliterate these things and type them out. And that was to be used for the book when it was published. So I began doing that in 1968.
Well, I remember that I asked him, because I had read somewhere that some Brahmins had been murdered in India, you know, and I was wondering, you know, Krishna always protects his devotees, you know. And so that was one question that I asked him, you know, if these were Brahmins, how come they were being murdered? And Prabhupada answered me that, you know, not all Brahmins are really, you know, are really Brahminical, and that, you know, many times that people, you know, are actually acting in a way that is not Brahminical, you know, and passing themselves off as a Swami or whatever, you know, but, you know, that really what you're getting is not anything close to what they should be, you know. So it was a nice answer to the question.
Yeah, regarding Mayavadis, there's an indirect Mayavadi meeting between a very famous person, a famous yogi who used to teach people how to meditate. He's well known. I won't even mention his name because Prabhupada said don't. Anyway, he has a big ashram in Rishikesh. So, when we went to Rishikesh, Prabhupada's arrival there was quite a big event because, you know, Rishikesh is the home of the Mayavadis. So, as it turned out, many of the teachers of this famous yogi all came to talk to Prabhupada and to start coming to Prabhupada's darshans. And Prabhupada's darshans were brilliant. I mean, I don't know how Prabhupada did it because he was really ill, but they were brilliant. And gradually, I think this, you know, yogi became very, very concerned that all of his teachers were coming to Prabhupada. So one of them finally came with a message that, Swamiji, you are very ill, so you should take rest and not exert yourself in this way, or you will not be able to easily recover. And Prabhupada was so pleased with that. He said he has indirectly admitted his defeat.
Hayagriva went to work in Columbus, Ohio, at Ohio State University as an English professor. And Prabhupada wrote and said, start a center there and take Pradyumna with you. Pradyumna does brahmachari. All right, so I went with Hayagriva. And Hayagriva and I shared an apartment in Columbus. And we started something called the OSU Yoga Society, and became very successful. We had a lot of student participation. And gradually I acquired a house, rented a house in Columbus, and we turned it into a center, and invited Prabhupada to come, which he did in 1969 in May. And Hayagriva was quite friendly with Allen Ginsberg. In fact, Allen had come a couple of times through Columbus, and we met Allen. We went to chant with him. At that time, Allen Ginsberg used to lecture at universities all over the country and recite his poetry. And before the poetry recitation, he'd always chant Hare Krishna for like 20 minutes or something. He'd lead a big kirtan, and then he would recite poetry. So we went along with him to Ohio Wesleyan University, Hayagriva and I and a few other people from our group, and we joined in the kirtan and everything and went riding around with him. So Hayagriva wrote to Ginsberg, would you consider coming to Columbus and doing a joint program with Swami Bhaktivedanta? All right, Allen Ginsberg agreed. So in May we had a huge event at Ohio State University with you know, the poet and the Swami. We had a big poster with Ginsberg on one side and Prabhupada on the other. And we rented a huge hall at the university, the biggest auditorium, put posters up all over, and we had a massive crowd. And Prabhupada came to Columbus. Ginsberg came too. He stayed in our house. Ginsberg and his boyfriend, Peter Orlovsky, came and stayed for like 2 or 3 days, and they had interesting. At that time I was working, so I couldn't be there during the day to take part in the talks, but of course they were talking a lot about India and about poetry and etc. and music. Anyway, we had the event was very successful. We had maybe 1,000 people were there, and when Prabhupada got up to dance, Prabhupada got up on stage and danced, and the entire audience got up and danced. It was the most wonderful sight I've ever seen. It was completely spontaneous, and it was wonderful.
Morning walks in Hawaii. I went on quite a few morning walks. We used to go to. I went to one morning walk when I first went to Hawaii, and we went out. I think it was near Waikiki. I think it was Paradise Island or someplace like that near Waikiki. And I was late the first morning, and I was like feeling really bad because I had overslept, and all the big shots were there and sort of gave me this, and Prabhupada just looked at me and laughed and said, "Well, better late than never," He was always pretty casual, and always encouraging. He was never discouraging, in his instruction. And then after I was initiated, we used to, when I was able to stay there a little bit longer, we used to go drive to the other side of Oahu to the nice beaches over there. And that was always really nice. Driving over in the morning was a beautiful drive, and then walking on the beach and then driving back. And I remember one morning we were driving over there, and when you get near the coast, there's a big kind of it's a rock, but it's the size of an island, off the highway over there. And Prabhupada made the remark that there are fish in the ocean that could swallow this, And I was just some hick from Detroit, but I didn't have any problem, believing that, that there was, that there were, fish in the ocean that were huge, and that that the moon was farther away than the sun. When that came up, I didn't really have any problem, accepting that, because I figured, I really accepted the fact that I was like the frog, and Prabhupada, knew a lot more than I did, So it was nice going over there for morning walks. It was just the atmosphere was very nice. And that was on one of those morning walks that Prabhupada remarked that if there is any enjoyment in this material world, it is here on Oahu, because Hawaii is just so beautiful,
We were walking with Srila Prabhupada, and I was asking a few questions. I don't really recall the questions. But then Prabhupada at one point, he stopped and he looked directly at me, and he quoted Bhagavad Gita 2:64. And that verse has so much in purport, so much to do with renunciation of the senses, controlling the mind, and depending, on Krishna's mercy. So I took that very much to heart. And I, started living a very sort of austere life, where I would chant, 48 rounds every day. I'm sorry, 42 rounds. I said 48 people, 42 rounds. And I would sleep, for a long, long time. I would sleep in about 3 hours. I would get up 12:30, 1 o'clock, chant most of my rounds before Arti, do some reading. And I was eating once a day in that way. But that instruction, it was like so piercing. And it was Mahabodhi who reminded me of that, because he was saying how we were all together, and Prabhupada just almost knocked me over, with that instruction. And because even afterwards, the devotees were saying, Prabhupada gave you such a personal instruction, It's amazing. Because the next day, Mahabodhi got such an instruction, different kind of instruction, but he got a personal instruction. And so it was very clear in his mind. So we were talking about that the other day, and he was helping me to focus. And then I started thinking how that had much of influence in encouraging me in my life of sort of simplicity, and renunciation. Mm-hmm.
So as soon as I was married, Prabhupada had us, we came up to see Prabhupada, and immediately, someone's married, Prabhupada likes, well, now you're married, so now what's your service going to be? So immediately he gave us a very heavy service. He said, we're having our press, ISKCON Press in New York, and we need, for my books, we need to have a word processor, really. And so you can find out about IBM word processor. We can do Sanskrit diacritical marks. Please inquire about it, how much it will cost. And then since you were working, you pay for it. So I made the inquiries, and the salesman came, and I purchased this top-of-the-line IBM word processor and ordered it, and it was delivered. And he said, so she will type, we will send tapes, she will type, word process, and you will edit, she will type, and produce my books, send to New York, New York will print. And so the first was Nectar of Devotion. So we got the original, kind of in our bedroom, we had this word processor, and I went out to work in the day, and she'd be typing away Nectar of Devotion, and I'd be editing, and we'd send it to New York. We had this mail traffic between New York and Columbus. And then Ishopanishad was started, and we're doing Ishopanishad back and forth, and then it got too much because the press moved to Boston in 1969 in the fall, and Chandanacharya is in New York, and he's cutting up stuff and pasting us, and every time there was a correction, she'd have to type it out, we'd have to send it to New York for them to paste up. It got too much. They said, you have to come to where the press is. So I was president of the Columbus Temple at that time. I had to give that up, and then December 11th, 1969, we took a plane with a word processor on our laps to Boston, and we became part of the ISKCON Press in Boston.
When you say editing, tell me of that process.
Process of editing was I basically did the Sanskrit. I did some English editing at first, but then later I just did the Sanskrit editing. Sanskrit editing means I would put the correct diacritical marks on the Sanskrit words, and I would spell them correctly according to the international system. And for the word meanings, also I would adjust the grammar sometimes, and Prabhupada's grammar in the word for word, and also if something was missing, I would also send him a lot of queries. What about this? What about that? Is this missing? Is this okay? And I had a lot of letters from Prabhupada. Yeah, you can do this, you can do that. Yes, that's okay. A lot. And whenever prayers came up or whatever, I mean, I did everything like that. I did the calendar too. You know, Prabhupada said now you should do calendar every year. So for I don't know how many years, 10 years or something like that, I did the calendar for ISKCON, the almanac. And Prabhupada would send me his almanac, and then I would have to do all the dates. And I would send it to LA and it would be printed up.
And I remember another time we were getting ready to come back from the morning walk, and getting back in the car was always sort of chaotic somehow or another. I mean, Harikesh was Maharaj. He wasn't Maharaj back then, but he was Prabhupada's secretary, and everybody was running around trying to figure out who was going to go in which car, and everybody wanted to go with Prabhupada, you know. And so, you know, they were running around trying to get in the car and who was going to get in first, and Harikesh was running from one side of the car to the next with all this like taping and stuff all over them. And I was sitting in the back seat of the car with Prabhupada watching this whole thing, you know. And Prabhupada just shook his head and said, "My disciples are a little crazy, I think." So it was nice. But he accepted us, you know. I realized, you know, that we were all so unqualified, you know, to do what we were doing, you know, but simply by his mercy, you know, we were able to carry on and accomplish, you know, a few things anyway. And there was also in Hawaii when, I can't remember what the devotee's name was, he was temple president for there for a while, but he wanted to, when he wanted to first buy the sailboat in Hawaii, and he was trying to sell this to Prabhupada, the idea of buying a boat and going from island to island. And he said, Srila Prabhupada, all we need is 12 good men. And Srila Prabhupada immediately replied, we do not have 12 good men in all of ISKCON. So I think he understood that, you know, we were totally unqualified, you know, and, you know, to pretty much of a degree still are, but he still accepted us and accepted our service, which was really nice. You know.
Another time we went to Bhaktivinoda Thakur's birthplace, because Prabhupada was trying to negotiate to get that birthplace, and the horn failed, and Prabhupada had us take a dish, a plate, and leaning out the window, bang the plate with a metal spoon in replacement for the horn, because in India you drive with a horn. So we're just out there the whole time, banging on the side with a metal plate. So many ways Prabhupada, you know, was the master of time, expert judge of time, place, and circumstance, knew what to do. Always knew what to do.
Now, Prabhupada considered phones a nuisance, actually. He never had a phone in his room that I recollect. And maybe there was a phone around, so there was a phone at 26th Avenue somewhere, but when Prabhupada picked up the phone, he'd like pick up the receiver and he'd hold it like, he wouldn't hold it like we hold phones, he'd hold it like this, like it was a strange object, and he'd speak into it. He wasn't used to using a phone. And I don't think he liked phones. I think he considered them a nuisance. He commented a few times, how can you leave, your phone is ringing all the time, people, it's a nuisance. In India, if someone doesn't call before they come, they show up at your door, and you say, aye, come in. It's not. Prabhupada, one time we were sitting in his room in LA, he said, our Indian philosophy, he said, it is open door, open window, open mind. He said, this is our philosophy. We do not like to be blocked in. So that was philosophy.
Then later, we started meeting with Srila Prabhupada more often. I joined the library party. I joined Setsu Maharaj, Hridayananda Maharaj. Then we started traveling around, distributing books, contract sets in America and Europe. We had one wonderful encounter with Srila Prabhupada after we had started the work. So we met him in San Francisco. I think it was at, let's see, I think it was at Jayananda's house, at his apartment. And so Prabhupada wanted all of the devotees to come in. He had heard about our work. And he talked to us so sweetly. Then he gave each of us some prasadam. He came up one by one. And he gave us a flower. And what was really, really significant that always stayed with me is that we were asking him some questions about how to do the work. And two things. First thing he told us, he says, you try your best and Krishna will help you. And we took that very seriously. We were realizing that if Prabhupada wants this to go on, because Srila Prabhupada was very pleased that books, before they were even written, that there was such an audience waiting for them. See, the idea of the contract sale was that we would find professors, universities, museums, and also libraries who would agree to take any book that Prabhupada, that we had now available, and any book that comes out later in print. So what's more wonderful for an author than knowing not only are people taking my book, but they're waiting. So let me finish writing so they can be able to receive those books.
At every program we ever held, one of the main things Prabhupada was concerned in India, the books must be displayed. And he wanted someone to get up at some part, and they don't do this anymore in this country, but he wanted someone to stand up and describe the books and what each book is about. That was supposed to be part of each program. You're supposed to hold up. One man was supposed to bring the books up and say, this is this book about this is book about this, and there would be a book table. No program was complete if it didn't have a book table and someone didn't introduce the books to the public. And then he would say, you can go in the back and take a look at these books. The programs were meant for selling his books. The books were the basis. The books were the main thing. Because they can come and hear a lecture, but they may forget, but the book will remind them. At every program, Prabhupada insisted we introduce the books.
Prabhupada always considered that 4 books were necessary. The Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, that's Nectar Devotion, and Chaitanya Charitamrita. Those were the necessary books. And outside of that, everything is really extra. However, one time we were in New York in Prabhupada's room, and I think Radha Vallabha asked Prabhupada, so after you finish the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada, what books would you like to translate? And Prabhupada said, oh, maybe it's Jiva Goswami, Shatsandarbha, or Vedanta Sutra, or he said there's so many, or Bhagavad Gita. And someone spoke up, Prabhupada, you already did the Bhagavad Gita. Prabhupada said, so, he said, we did. He said, Bhagavad Gita. He said, there are so many commentaries, he said, we did parts, we did a small. He said, there are many kinds, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, everyone has given their Gita. He said, we said we could do many Gitas, not just one. So he had a conception like that.
Another time in Hawaii, Yogi Bhajan came to visit Prabhupada. And, you know, you don't hear much about him these days, but he was pretty big back in those days. He had a pretty good following. And so he came to visit Prabhupada, and I went up to his room while he was up there. And he was putting together this international conference. It was a peace conference. And he was inviting all types of, you know, spiritual masters and religious leaders to come to his conference. So he was trying to sell this idea to Srila Prabhupada. And he just started talking about it, you know, was getting a little bit into it, and Prabhupada just stopped him and said that there would never be any world peace until everyone could agree that Krishna was the Supreme Personality and that everything belonged to Krishna, you know, because Prabhupada mentioned many times that the peace formula was that Krishna was the Supreme Personality of Godhead and that everything was his property and he was a proprietor of everything. And so he stopped Yogi Bhajan from you know, even presenting this, and Yogi Bhajan kept on trying to, you know, get in to try to sell this idea, and it was basically just for his glorification. But Prabhupada just, you know, kept stopping him and reiterating this point, you know, that there would be never any peace unless everybody accepted that Krishna was the Supreme Personality and everything was his property. So he left a little frustrated, you know, because Prabhupada, you know, would not say that he was going to come or not, you know, because he just, you know, Yogi Bhajan just couldn't accept this point, you know. He was thinking that he was the Supreme Personality, you know. So he left a little frustrated, but after he left, Srila Prabhupada said that him and his men, you know, because they're Sikhs, they wear turbans like that, he said that they should be the Kshatriyas, you know, of ISKCON. So, you know, even though there was, you know, vast philosophical differences between them, Prabhupada was always thinking about how he could bring everybody into, you know, into Krishna's family. It was really nice to see.
Shyam Sundar one time had an idea that we'll invite the creme de la creme to meet Prabhupada, and we'll have a series of discussions. So he invited certain people, and he arranged discussions. We went to see Toynbee at his apartment. Of course, Toynbee was very old at that time. And so we all went to see Toynbee. And he arranged for several lords to come to see Prabhupada. And I forget the name of the fellow, but he was one of the very prominent members of the House of Lords, a British gentleman. And so he came to Bhaktivedanta Manor. And it was basically myself and him and Prabhupada, I think, for most of the time. And sat down, Lord such and such, and Prabhupada's favorite, or he's seen most commonly, he would attack the English for eating meat, for meat eating. And he'd say, you know, and at that time he had one kind of he proposed that to start a separate society. And he would call it the Society of Sinless Men. And he said, we know with these English, he said they're very good in many respects, he said, but one thing, he said, they like to eat and meat and they like to drink. And so he said that is a problem. But he said if we can maybe convince them not to sin and start one society for sinless men, he said, that is my idea. So this Lord came. And he was very high up in the House of Lords. He was one of the major people there. And he sat down, and he was also old, so Prabhupada greets him respectfully and greets him. And Prabhupada says, I said, how old are you? And he says, and the Lord was slightly older than Prabhupada. And Prabhupada says, begins at once, he says, anyway, it was very funny, because this Lord was also born in Calcutta. And Prabhupada says, so you from where are you from in England? He said, actually, I was born in Calcutta. And the person says, oh, well, what street? And he said, such and such a street. And it was not very far from where Prabhupada, or was he, you know, he said, what street? And in fact, they were living in Calcutta at the same time when Prabhupada was young, you know, the first few years. Maybe he was 1 year older than Prabhupada, something like that. And then so Prabhupada launched on the philosophy, on preaching, and he said, no, he said, you have very many good qualities, but one thing that we question, he says, how you can follow the philosophy of Jesus Christ, do not kill, and you kill the poor animals and eat them. And the British lawyer says, well, he says, that's the problem here. He says, and he said, the Prabhupada said, but you must be a hypocrite if you do that. And he said, well, actually, myself, I'm a vegetarian. And I was like, you're a vegetarian? He said, yes, I've been a vegetarian for many years. It was funny seeing Prabhupada with this English lord, and it happened to be born in Calcutta at the same time. He was also a vegetarian. And then Prabhupada proposed to him that I have one proposition. I want to start a society called the Society for Sinless Men. Please help.
So we came, the library, devotees working with the library party, we came in to see Srila Prabhupada, and he gave us this very simple technique. And the technique was that we should get the order from a very prestigious professor, university, or institution. And after getting it, we should keep it, or keep a copy of it. And then when we visit other universities, or other persons connected in academia, we should show them the order that we receive. And it was a simple thing. When you think about it, he was really telling us everybody has their gurus, everybody has their acharyas. And everyone wants to be about something that's successful or important. And what important people do, others will also do. So we started doing that as we traveled through America, through Europe, and some of the other places, India. We started using that as a technique. We would go to those places. We take the most difficult place or the most prestigious place. And whatever we get from there, then we would go to other institutions, other professors, and show them, oh, such and such. And I did this, for instance, one of the biggest sales we ever had in the history of the library party was at Brigham Young University. And I met the spiritual head of the Mormon church at that time. And, they had, I think, an academic head and a spiritual head. And I'm not sure which one. It's so long ago that I met. But I met one of the heads. And he was so enthused about Srila Prabhupada's books. He knew many, many languages, about 20 languages. He was a linguist, historian, philosopher, etc. And he had been studying various things from Vedic cosmology. So when he saw Prabhupada's books, the way it was formatted and the detail, he was in ecstasy. He bought complete set of Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita for himself, ordered for his department library, wrote a note and told the librarian for the general library, buy these books, everything this book salesman has. Now when I took his order, took his letter to the librarian, then when I started visiting other departments, see, at most schools we would sell books maybe to the history department, philosophy, comparative literature, religion, and sometimes we could stretch it to other places. But here, I had the letter from the Acharya of the Institute. So every place, every department I would go to, I would talk with them, and I would tell them that I had just went to visit such and such, and he was such a nice person, and I probably just pulled it out kind of casually. He bought this, and they would practically snatch the sheet from me and see, oh, Hugh Nibley, that was his name, he's gotten this. Oh, let me. Also, I want the same thing. And then in a few cases, he had given me some professors to see. And I would go see the professor, and I would tell them that I was sent by Hugh Nibley, and they would be so happy. Oh, he knows me? He sent you? And it was just so easy. It was all based on the technique that Srila Prabhupada had given us. By the time I left that university, I think I had distributed about 16 or 17 standing orders. All the major departments had 4 Bhagavatam sets, Chaitanya Charitamritas. So almost 20 book sets just in that one school, just from that little technique.
One time Prabhupada called me, Gorsundar and I were sitting in Prabhupada's room in Hawaii, and Prabhupada said, so you boys both know Bengali. He said, why don't you translate some of the important works of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like Chaitanya Shikshamrita or Jaiva Dharma. So these books he considered important books, particularly these 2 books, Jaiva Dharma and Chaitanya Shikshamrita. And some other books he didn't consider so important. You know, Harinam Harinam Chintamani is out there, and a lot of people. One time I used to carry it around with me because I liked reading about the offenses. I usually had to lecture about the offenses for the initiations, because I do the initiations. Every initiation probably say, now explain the 10 offenses. So I'd have to listen, I'd recite the 10 offenses, and I like to, and also for observing them myself. So I had it. So one time Prabhupada was chanting in his room with the doing bhajan recording, and I had a book with me, and I took it out with me, and Prabhupada said, "What's that book?" I said, Harinama Chintamani. He said, "Why are you still reading?" He said, "That's not a very important book." I said, "Well, it's about the offenses." He said, "You still, about offenses, you're still learning." He said, "Finish." You're still learning about offenses. He didn't consider. The very important books of Bhakti Vinod he considered to be Jaiva Dharma and Chaitanya Shikshamrita. And so he asked me and Goswami to translate those at one time. And he considered that to be, and naturally he'd read those very much in himself. Jaiva Dharma, I think, is the best book of all. If you took one Gaudiya Vedanta, one book from the Sampradaya, I think Jaiva Dharma would be the most important. Because Bhakti Vinod in it, he takes all the primary points from Rupa Goswami and from Chaitanya Charitamrita and from the Bhagavatam, and he puts it all in one book, and he explains it very nicely. So it's an important book in that way. He kind of concisely presents everything in one book.
I was at a lecture where Prabhupada said, you know, I have written these books, especially for my devotees. He said, it's not a question of just selling the books. He says, well, you must read the books. Another time we were on it was Marine Drive in Bombay. Rupanuga Prabhu, I believe, was there also. And he was visiting. He was a guest. GBC secretary would come in cycle 1 month of each year. And the issue came about wearing karmi clothes. And Prabhupada viewed in favor, it doesn't matter what they wear, whatever will best distribute the books. Another time, our Radha Damodar party, we decided to use incense packs as a warmer, you know, you can say a warmer, you know, to get the person warmed up. So a person would buy a pack of incense, and then, you know, basically we would give them a book and ask for something further if they would give. So when this was told to Prabhupada, I told them what we were doing is that generally we usually gave about, you know, 4 packs of incense, a pack of incense for $1, and on the 5th pack of incense, we would give a big book plus, you know, get a little bit of extra money. And each time we gave the pack, we give it back to Godhead. So Prabhupada that was reported to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, oh, this is not good. And he wrote a letter in response to Ramesh for saying this should be stopped. I happened to show up that day in Bombay to take my turn as a secretary. And the secretary, Hansa Duda, told me, you know, this letter is going out. I rushed into Prabhupada. I said, sure, Prabhupada, I don't mind, but then I have to say that our orders are going to be going down about 50%. Prabhupada stopped. He said, are you paying the book fund? I said, not only are we paying, we always have a credit. Then he called his secretary back and he said, destroy that letter. He said, never mind then. If you're paying for the books, okay.
Prabhupada had a copy of Mahabharata with him. He had a few books in his room. He had Srimad Bhagavatam, 2 editions, complete with 8 commentaries. Srimad Bhagavatam comes with originally, or there's one edition that was published way back in the last century with 8 commentaries. It's called the Ashtatika Bhagavatam. And Prabhupada liked that edition. And those tikas are considered authoritative. The Sridhar Swami, Vira Raghavacharya, Vijayadwaja, Shukadeva, Jiva Goswami, Vishwanath Chakravarti, etc. And Prabhupada read that commentary. That was the Bhagavatam that Prabhupada used for his translation work, and always referred to that very respectfully, the Ashtatika Bhagavatam. So Prabhupada had one edition of that and one other edition with 3 commentaries, and he had the Mahabharata and the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and the original Gita published from Gaudiya Math with Vishwanath Chakravarti commentary. Prabhupada liked the commentary of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti on the Gita, and were several places in there that kind of were changed his were important in his own devotional process. There's one verse about obeying the order of the spiritual master that Prabhupada said many times. When he read that, then he realized something about the spiritual master, and he used to refer to that. He said this portion of this comment, it was very important for him. But primarily for Bhagavad Gita, he used the commentary of Baladeva Bhushan, which is very complete.
There was another incident that happened that, I could understand how Prabhupada was very protective of ISKCON, because when I first went to Hawaii, there was one devotee there who was a little puffed up, and he was a little arrogant and actually rude to Srila Prabhupada. But Prabhupada just encouraged him and was very kind to him and didn't want him to leave. And I could see the way he treated him, that the Prabhupada really didn't take offense very easily. But there was another devotee who had kind of his own little scene going on there. And when I was driving back from a morning walk one morning, he was speaking against ISKCON. And I mentioned it to Paramahamsa Swami, who mentioned it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada got very angry and didn't allow this man to preach anymore at the temple. So I can understand that for himself, Prabhupada was very lenient and very tolerant. He really didn't accept, much offense, Although the devotee who was offensive to him eventually left because Krishna didn't tolerate, that he was offending Prabhupada. But as far as ISKCON was concerned, Prabhupada really didn't tolerate fault-finding, of his disciples, and was very intolerant of that kind of behavior. And there was another, I think it was one of his godbrothers came to visit him in Hawaii, and he stayed for a day or two, and during that time he was criticizing the way the devotees were chanting. And he had spoken to Brahmananda about it, and I think a couple other devotees, that the devotees were not concentrating on when they were chanting, that they were, not paying attention enough. So the devotees went to Prabhupada and were, after this sannyasi left, and were, a little perturbed about that, and were disturbed that they weren't chanting properly. And Prabhupada just dismissed it and said, he said, just chant and listen. He said, so he made it very simple for us. He said, just chant and listen. There wasn't any, well, you're not concentrating on this or whatever like that, or not listening properly or whatever. It was just chant and listen. He made it very simple because he realized that we were just neophytes, And he was very protective of his disciples that way. So it was nice. It was nice to see. He was really like a father, And we were like his children. We couldn't really do very much wrong, although we were always making mistakes. So.
We found sometimes the professors who were not, so senior, some of them sometimes had trouble with Srila Prabhupada. We found, in most cases, the top guys, even if they were totally against what Prabhupada had written. I'll give you an example. I had one professor to say, I don't like his interpretations, but I am completely amazed at his gall in taking up the Srimad Bhagavatam. See, because even amongst the scholars, the Bhagavad Purana is most complex, and it drives them batty, because they think it's the Krishna of the Gita, the Krishna of the Bhagavatam, the Krishna of Mathura. They think it's sometimes a different Krishna. They just can't see how the same personality can be involved in so much. And for Prabhupada to take on the Bhagavatam and to explain things in such a way. So I've had professors to say that they wanted the books, they would buy all the books, and they'd be in total disagreement. But they were so amazed at Prabhupada's presentation and his gall. And then we would have many of those who just knew that Prabhupada was giving the best presentation on Bhakti, and they wanted it. And some of these professors, it was just amazing that these professors are studying intimate things about Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami and whatnot. So some of them were sort of like fallen Brahmins from a previous life. They would be so fascinated with this subject matter. And they would relish the book like anything, even though they couldn't follow any of the principles.
I remember one particular morning walk in Denver. I had gone there, it was after I was initiated, and I was traveling a little bit with Prabhupada. We went to Denver, then Chicago for the Rath Yatra. and we went for a morning walk in Denver, and Prabhupada was talking about changing bodies, you know, how the body changes. And I happened to say something about growing, and, you know, and he jumped on me, you know, because he understood that I did not understand what he was talking about, the difference between growing and changing. And the concept that the body is changing in every second, and it's like the frames of a movie. And he really pressed this point home to me for, like, you know, a good 20 minutes, you know, and, you know, was asking me, do you understand? Because, and I realized that I had been so brainwashed by Darwinian scientists, you know, to this idea of growth and evolution, you know, this whole concept, that the idea of, you know, that the body changes every second and changes, and that death is just another change. That I really didn't grasp the concept very well, and you know, I realized that I had to be re-educated, you know, that I was totally brainwashed by modern science. So, but Prabhupada was very patient, you know, and you know, I've heard some people, you know, when I've talked about Prabhupada's books, and they, you know, I've heard some friends of mine, you know, who are not devotees say, well, doesn't it just say the same thing? And to a certain degree, it is saying the same thing over and over again. But, you know, Srila Prabhupada really wanted us to understand just the basics of Krishna consciousness, because we're not so highly elevated and educated about, you know, Vedic philosophy, and that's why in his lectures, you know, he stresses the same points over and over again. You're not this body, and it's so easy to forget and to fall under the illusion again, you know, that he really, really pressed home just the basics many, many times, especially when I was hearing him preaching and traveling with him.
I forget how the topic came up, but Prabhupada said the Goswamis, he said, they never thought about being published. He said, that's the attitude. He says, you don't think about it. He said they never thought about wanting to be published. Kind of struck me, a shock to me, but I could see that the Goswamis, they would write a book, and you can, if you look at all the Goswami books in the beginning, it's a line usually for my friend Sanatan Goswami. Rupa would write it, Sanatan would write for my friends, and afterwards they became copied. They were sent to Bengal to be copied, and that was the way books were published in those days. But in the beginning, they were just, you know, they were written for the pleasure, actually, of a few friends. He said so he said the Goswami thing. He said that's the Goswami ideal, is they're not, you know, that I'm an author or that I've been published. They weren't thinking in that way at all.
I don't know. I kept pretty quiet. He would always ask, you know, what I thought of you know, what was going on. You know, he would say, well, what is your opinion? He would call me Maharaj Ambarish. He'd say, well, what is your opinion, Maharaj Ambarish? You know, and I would never want to say very much because I didn't want to make a fool out of myself. You know, like one time in India, we were on a morning walk, and we were walking on Juhu Beach in Bombay, and he said, so they say this is the most beautiful beach in the world. What do you think? You know, and this is, you know, there was like dogs and fires and people selling jewelry, and I mean, I'd been in Hawaii, you know, I didn't really think it was all that great, but it was like, you know, you're kind of on the spot, you know, and so I didn't know what to say, you know, should I say it's a nice beach, or should I say, you know, should I agree with him, or what should I say, you know? So many times like that, he would ask me my opinion, and I would, you know, be kind of quiet. So, you know, I think he realized that I was a little bit shy, you know, so he was pretty lenient with me, you know, he didn't lean too heavily on me, you know, because I've heard a lot of stories, you know, how he used to blast Tamal Krishna, and he never really did that to me, because I think he realized that I was probably, you know, disintegrate if he ever did.
Another time, famous story, of course, where we had our Radha Damodar party, and, you know, we were quite energetic. By the time that 1 year was over, we were giving 40% of the total proceeds to the BBT of the whole movement. Big party, but, you know, after a year and a half. But we were creating quite a bit of disturbance because some brahmacharis were leaving the temples, wanting to be with the sannyasis, and the sannyasis, of course, were saying it's better for brahmacharis to be with us than to be under these grihastha temple presidents. So by the time we went to India, we brought with us like 90 brahmacharis, Radha Damodar party. You know, we had the whole second floor, or third floor of the, you know, Lotus building. And we were riding the crest wave of success. We had just given, I mean, it was huge. I remember the Christmas marathon was so competitive. There was such a heavy competition between California, Jaya Tirtha, and the Radha Damodar party. I remember Rameswar was right in between. He was a real transcendental personality, getting everybody to compete, and I told him, he kept saying, how much are you going to give? How much are you going to give to the book fund? I said, I'm going to send you a check, and this is a blank check. I'm going to send it to you. Put it in your safe, and whatever they give, whatever the amount is, add 10,000 and deposit into a clear at the end of the month. And that was my challenge. I was very determined we're going to defeat them. So we gave, by the end, we gave $195,000 to the book fund. $195,000. This was 1975 marathon, Christmas marathon. $195,000 to the book fund. One party. $190,000. We did $250,000 back to God. Had 60,000 big books. It was a massive thing. So, but it just, people were getting so agitated. So when they came, all the temple presidents complained to Prabhupada. And, I was sitting in the room, and Prabhupada was just looking at me. Then everybody left, and I just kept sitting there. I knew I better just keep sitting here, because I thought I better talk to Prabhupada alone. And Prabhupada just looked at me, and I said, oh. I said, I don't know what to do. I said, maybe I should just, go to China or something. It's like, I'll go to the moon. I just said like that. Anyway, I walked out. The next morning, right in the middle of Arti, someone tapped me, and I went up to my room. Trivikram came in. And Trivikram walked in the room. As soon as I saw Trivikram, it was either Trivikram or Harisar, I forget. Maybe it was Harisar. I said, I'm not going. I'm not going. He said, how do you know what's going on? I said, I'm not going. Somehow I knew those words, when I was in the Mangal Arti, I just started to think, I was thinking, what did I say? What is going to happen? As soon as I saw Prabhupada's servant, I just said, I'm not going. He said, what do you mean? He said, Prabhupada wants to see you. I said, I'm not going. Meant I'm not going up to see him, and I'm not going to China. So Prabhupada came, finally I came up, I had to come up. And I was sitting there, and I think Guru Kripa and Manavisa were behind me. And Prabhupada he had just gone to the bathroom. First he said, I want you to go to China. I said, China? I said, Prabhupada, the Radha Damodar party. I said, I have to be there. He said, no, I want you to go to China. And he walked out to go to the bathroom, brush his teeth and freshen up for his walk. And he came back and sort of putting on tilak, he had his tilak, Prabhupada would have the tilak mirror. And he said, I want you to go to China. And I said, but I started to give excuses that if I go to China, what's going to happen to the party? Prabhupada says, don't worry about the party. And his bottom lip started to quiver. He was shaking his hand. He said, don't worry about the party. I said, but this is a very important service. Prabhupada said, he said, I take that service away from you. You have no other service to do now. Either you go to China, or you sit in Mayapur and chant Hare Krishna. There's nothing else for you to do. So Guru Kripa was sitting behind. He said, I'll go to China. Prabhupada said, no, he must go to China. So I was sitting there going, oh. Then suddenly I realized, wait a moment. All of the Radha Damodar party, everything is really meant for Prabhupada's pleasure. And if by going to China, Prabhupada will be pleased, my life is made. So immediately I just looked at Prabhupada and said, okay, I'm ready to go. And Prabhupada just beamed. Then we went upstairs because Prabhupada would walk on the roof, around and around, and he announced, Tamal Krishna Maharaj is going to China. I know everybody went, Jai Haribo! And Prabhupada turned this heavy situation, into like a glorious act. So he was so expert. And he never really said too much about the whole thing. He never said to me, people are complaining about you, this or that. He found a way to correct an entire situation and open up something wonderful for Krishna. He found a way to turn what appeared to be a very negative situation into a very positive event.
I remember when there was this group in LA that was interested in the gopis and things. And I'd just come from Udupi, where I'd been studying a lot the Bhagavad Gita. And so I was with Prabhupada, and I mentioned to Prabhupada that some people had said to me in LA that this Gita with Krishna and Arjuna, that's lower. And that they have no taste in that. We're interested in the gopi things. We're interested in Krishna and the gopi. After all, that's the highest, that's the thing we're after. The Gita is kind of like, and I thought that was a very disrespectful attitude. So I mentioned it to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada says, who says this? Bring them here. Who is it? What are the names? I said, I don't know. Someone said, and then, so I had to go inquire. He said, bring them here immediately. Whoever says this. So the members of a group that were discussing the qualities of the gopis and what were the saris they were wearing, things like that. So they were brought into Prabhupada's room. And then the temple president shows up, and everyone shows up, and this thing started. And now Prabhupada said, so were you interested in the gopi thing? So you, yes. And Prabhupada said, some discussion went on, and then Prabhupada someone said, well, isn't it true that in Goloka Vrindavan the position of the gopi is the highest? The gopis are the highest. They're higher than like a cow, for instance, or a blade of grass. The gopis is the highest. And Prabhupada said, no difference. No difference. Probably between the gopi and the cow, and the blade. No difference. For you, no difference. And it was like a lightning bolt. He was just absolutely adamant, absolutely fierce. For you, no difference. And philosophically, of course, from the very high platform, when you're actually have the perception of what is transcendental, you may make distinctions. But from the material platform, you can make no distinction about the transcendental realm. It has to be, it's there. You can make no distinction whatsoever. You do make a distinction, you make it on a material basis, not a spiritual. So for you, if you make a distinction, you're off the track, way off the track. It means you've deviated, you're off the road. Make no distinction up to a point. And that point is when you actually have some revelation on your own. So Prabhupada was very, when questions came at that level from people who are not at the right level, he got very angry about it on a number of occasions.
Right after I was initiated in '75, I was initiated in the spring, and then Srila Prabhupada asked me to come to India in the fall. So I went to, I flew to Kenya to meet him in Nairobi, and then we went on from there to India. So I remember in Nairobi there's a lot of Indian life members in Nairobi. So Srila Prabhupada got asked to go to many engagements, and he would go to people's houses, take prasadam, or go to give a lecture in front of a lot of people. And inevitably he would lecture in Hindi. And so we all accompanied him when he went on these lectures. And he would lecture in Hindi, and I would never really know what he was saying. But he would often, during the lecture, he would bring me into the lecture somehow, or I would be listening, and it would be like Hindi. I wouldn't understand anything, and then all of a sudden I would hear my name, and Prabhupada would go like this. I'd be sitting out in the audience. He would go like this. So I hear my name, so he'd go like this, and I'd stand up, and then he'd lecture a little bit more, something about a crore of rupees or something like that, and then he'd go like that, sit down. So it was really nice actually to. I was feeling at the time, and I still feel that way, that this is like the perfection of, being engaged by the spiritual master, where you can help him, assist him in his preaching efforts, And even though I didn't understand, the lecture, what he was talking about, just to be able to assist him in that way was really nice. It was a really personal service.
We had a tent. We had a tent city there. And Prabhupada had paid 8,000 rupees through Sagar. Madhavis, I believe, went with this guy, Sagar Maharaj, who was a Gaudiya Math sannyasi. Actually, he had been rejected by the Gaudiya Math, but we didn't know it. And he told Prabhupada, he came one day, and he said, I can arrange it to Kumbh Mela. So I think Prabhupada sent Madhavisa with him. Anyway, they paid 8,000 rupees to rent the tents and everything, and we all set up, and we had a fantastic Mela, Kumbh Mela. Then everybody left to go to Gorakhpur, and they were all waiting at the train, and the only persons left at the campsite were Prabhupada and myself. We were going to go at the end in a rickshaw to the train. So what happened was that this Sagar Marsh cheated us and cheated the tent wallas. He didn't pay them the full price. So these huge guys, Sikhs, huge guys came in and they demanded from Prabhupada, that he pay them the balance. And I mean, I was scared stiff. I mean, these guys were 6 foot something, 200 plus pounds. And, little Prabhupada's frail personality. I mean, it was 1971. He was very strong, but still frail. Prabhupada couldn't have been more than 5 foot 6 inches high, and I wasn't much more than that. And these guys were bearing down on Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, no, we have given you the money, and we will not give any more money. And he was on and on talking with them all. And he said, no, no. And they were yelling and yelling, and I didn't know what was going to happen. And finally, Prabhupada said, he just got up. He took his chadar, threw his chadar up, and he said, let us go immediately. And he walked out, and they started following him, screaming. Prabhupada called a rickshaw, got in the rickshaw and said, go to the train station. And we just drove off. And Prabhupada could be very strong like this.
Prabhupada said one time, there's a story about Prabhupada and his Guru Maharaj. One time there was a lecture in Bombay, and Guru Maharaj was speaking. And Prabhupada said, we were in the audience, and I'm sitting next to an old gentleman. He said, just to show how strict Guru Maharaj was, we're sitting listening to Guru Maharaj. Guru Maharaj is speaking, and I am listening very attentively. And an old gentleman is sitting next to me, and very respectable gentleman. And he couldn't hear something, so he leans over to me to ask, what is he saying or something? And I leaned over and I said, and immediately Guru Maharaj says, oh, and chastised me for not paying attention, for speaking while he was speaking. He said, Guru Maharaj is so strict like that. He said, even I'm sitting there, an old man next to me, very respectful, and he wants to hear, but yet I should not do in front of my Guru. He said, Guru Maharaj is so strict like that. So he said, that is the proper etiquette.
I had one experience of meeting one professor. We would wear suits, and we had cards, Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. So I came in to see the professor. I gave him my card. He looked at it, and he turned red, and his eyes were big, and he was practically foaming at the mouth. It took him almost like a minute before he finally was able to speak. I don't know whether to run out the room or whether the guy was having an epileptic fit or what. Go call find the doctor. Then finally he strained and he says, you, get out of here, get out of here. And just as I was getting out the door, I mean, I was ready to, I was going out. I don't know why he wanted me out, but I didn't want to be in his presence with that kind of energy. And then as I was walking out the door, he said, I've read these books. If people accept this philosophy, he said, I would have no job. So some of them were reading. He was a professor of Sanskrit. And he had read how Prabhupada had said that a teacher should teach by example. Teachers should have certain qualities. And he knew he's teaching the chain smoker, an alcoholic, a meat eater, flesh eater, that if this Vedic civilization was established and people accepted this as the rule of law for teaching, he would have no job. We saw both sides. We saw how many people were so appreciative, and they felt that Prabhupada's books added to their scholarship and gave them so much information, about Bhakti. Even some professors would say this. I had one professor take the Nectar Devotion. He says, this is the best book out on Bhakti. This is the best handbook. And he ordered it for his class and everything. And then we see other cases where the professor knew what was in the books and was very threatened because he saw that the books called people out based on what they really were. And he was not a teacher, by example.
I remember also at that time they were looking for a new temple in Nairobi, and I remember we drove around looking in different areas in Nairobi and in the car one morning. And we drove through this very, very nice neighborhood, and one of the sannyasis in the car, can't remember who it was, turned to Srila Prabhupada and said, "This is a very, very respectful neighborhood, or respectable neighborhood." And Prabhupada said, "Respectable means not Krishna conscious." And I always remember that because I've noticed that, the more money people have, especially in the West, the less interested they are in Krishna consciousness. But I always remember that he said that.
I was with Prabhupada many times when he had occasion to meet some of his godbrothers, and he treated them very respectfully. It's the etiquette that you're supposed to treat the godbrothers of the Guru, or your own godbrothers of the Guru, the same way as you treat the Guru. And you're supposed to treat your senior godbrothers in a particular way. That's Vaishnava etiquette, if you have senior godbrothers. So there's a story about that. Senior godbrother means initiated before you. And in Gaudiya Math, generally, there's an emphasis on senior god, but Prabhupada also observed this much. One time in Montreal, a scholar came to see Prabhupada, Indian scholar, and Janardhan was there, and myself. And I was always very eager to hear from Prabhupada, so I went up front. I mean, it was only Prabhupada sitting, and we were sitting there, but I kind of edged forward close because I wanted to catch every word. And I was a little ahead of Janardhan. And Janardhan was actually not only older in age to me, but he had been initiated before me. He was initiated in the first initiation, which took place, the first initiation Prabhupada did in New York. And Prabhupada immediately looked, he said, he said, he is your dada. He is your elder brother. He said, you should not sit in front of him. Not that I was in front of him, but I was ahead of him a little, closer to Prabhupada. He said, you should move back. He is senior to you, senior godbrother. This is the etiquette. He said, just like my godbrother, he said, Thirtha Maharaj, he used to be called Kunjada. Actually, his name was Kunja Bihari. Kunja Bihari Das was his name, but everyone calls him Kunjada. The Da means like the elder brother, like the uncle. So everyone called him Kunjada. Why? Because he was a very senior godbrother. He was one of most senior godbrothers. So similarly, he said we called him Kunjada. So he said, he is your Da, he is your elder brother, so you should give him respect. You should not sit before him. So that was the early 1960, 67, 60, 68 in Montreal.
We went from Nairobi, we flew to Bombay. And I'd never been in India before. It was quite an eye-opener for me. I'd never really been anywhere in the third world. But at that time, Srila Prabhupada had some plans to go to Kurukshetra to start to build a university there. So I had volunteered to make a donation to that project. So I came to India and I had called my office in Detroit to ask them to wire $150,000 to Prabhupada's account in Bombay. And at that time, I suppose they probably still do it, but at that time the banks in India, if they got a wire transfer somehow or another, they would misplace it for a couple of days so they could earn some interest on it. So when they called the bank to find out if the money had been deposited, the message came back that $15,000 had been deposited, and I know that $150,000 had been sent. So I freaked, And when we went to Srila Prabhupada to tell him this, and I was expecting him to get very upset, and he just laughed and he said, "Oh, it looks like they have lost a zero," and he was completely detached about it. It didn't seem to bother him at all. Where I was completely, upset about it. But it was amazing. He wasn't, and after a couple of days, they found the money, and so they were able to transfer the money. But and then shortly after that, we drove out to Kurukshetra, to look at the spot out there and find some land. And I remember that we went to the place where Krishna had spoken Bhagavad Gita. And we had been with a lot of the other people who lived in the area during the day, and they were trying to sell us land. And I can't remember what the man there who had some development there, but he was showing us his development. And it was nice, but it was kind of the whole atmosphere was kind of tinged by kind of the materialistic, kind of atmosphere of this man's project. But then afterwards, we drove out to the spot, just Prabhupada and his disciples, to the spot where Krishna spoke Bhagavad Gita. And I remember being there. It was like an incredibly serene place, and to be there with Prabhupada, you just felt the intenseness of the place, because Prabhupada said that the battle is perpetually going on there, and to be there with Srila Prabhupada, who's like just had this ancient, aura about him, was an incredible experience. And it was very quiet, and we stood there for a while, and Prabhupada said that this is the place that he wanted. This was the place he wanted to purchase land, and I'm pretty sure that they were able to buy that land, or somewhere in the vicinity, because from what I understand, that they were able to carry through with that project, and it's been started. So, but it was an experience that I'll always remember, to be there.
One time in London, when we were in London, Nanda Kumar was a kind of I don't want to call him a fanatic, but he's very concerned with health and eating the right things, and also with exercise. And he's very careful about his food. And so he was Prabhupada servant at cooking for Prabhupada. And so he was massaging Prabhupada, I think, in the morning, and he popped the question to Prabhupada. He said, "Prabhupada, I feel I need to do some kind of a exercise in my body. Isn't it good for a devotee to exercise? What kind of should we do? Can we do yoga? Or can we do some kind of physical exercise? It's very good for us, isn't it?" And Prabhupada said, "Yes." He said, "You can do, like, what it is called?" He said, "You can do," and he got out on the floor, and he did a full, very shaky push-up. He said, "What this is called?" And then of course it's called a push-up. He says, "Prabhupada, you could do that. It's good for brahmachari."
One concurrence I had with Srila Prabhupada was in Toronto. I was guarding his room, and at that time the door, Prabhupada's door, was glass, to his sitting room, so you could look in while you were guarding him, and you could watch him, part of the day as he was doing things. And what was most impressive to me is how Prabhupada had this regulated schedule. He was chanting his rounds and meeting so many people. But what was most impressive to me at that time, and I was pretty much of a new devotee, was to see him reading his own books. And I thought, oh, Prabhupada is reading his own books. How important it is for us to read the books. If here even the Guru is relishing his own books, then how much we should be relishing and appreciating, us even more. So those were qualities I was very, very impressed by.
He read his books. Whenever he traveled on the plane, he would read Gita or Bhagavatam or Nectar Devotion. He'd say, "See, I read my own books." He says, "Who reads their own books?" He says, "I'm reading my own books, but who reads their own books?" He said, "Therefore, it was not written by me. It was written by Krishna." Every plane trip, he'd have a Bhagavatam. His secretary would have a Bhagavatam. He said, "Where's the book?" And he'd open the book, and he'd be reading the book and thinking and reading and chanting and thinking. And many times he commented, "I read my own books, you see." He says, "But who reads their own books? You know anyone who reads their own books? People don't read their own books." He says, "Therefore, it's not written by me. It's written by Krishna."
Prabhupada asked me, this actually happened in Detroit, but it had to do with the Ford Foundation. It was doing a lot of work in India at the time, and I believe they still have a lot of things going on there. But Prabhupada had asked me to write to them to see if they were interested in supporting the Mayapur project. And I was a little reticent to do it because our family really doesn't have much influence over the Ford Foundation anymore, and so I was a little shy. But I did it anyway. I wrote a letter and I sent it to their chairman, and they had written back to say that they didn't really support any projects that were religiously oriented. And to add insult to injury, they said in the letter that the only way they would be able to support us was spiritually, which is, not what we needed. With Srila Prabhupada, we didn't need any more spiritual support. But I had gone to him and with the letter that they wrote back and read it to him. And he didn't say anything. I mean, it was just silent. And just went on to the next, the next appointment or whatever. And I remember feeling, very crushed, that I wasn't able to follow through with this. But Prabhupada was so heavy that when he was silent, it was like the whole universe was silent. When he laughed, the whole universe laughed. He felt jolly. But when he was silent, it was just so heavy, because you don't know what to think, but you just knew that it wasn't good. So,
when Prabhupada struck that deal for back to Godhead orders, so then they served us prasadam. And I asked Prabhupada at that time, is there any, can you give any special instruction on how to take prasadam? Prabhupada said, when taking prasadam, there are no rules. It is a matter of personal taste. I always remember this whenever I take prasadam with my godbrother Hridayananda Maharaj, because he and I have, of course now we have the same prasadam taste, but for a while he was a special prasadam addict of certain types of prasadam, and I always remembered Prabhupada said, it is a matter of personal taste.
One time in Hyderabad, I asked Prabhupada about astrology. So I was thinking at that time, I was interested in Indian astrology, and I was trying to understand how one's life is determined or not determined, and if you can read it in a chart, what you can read in a chart, what you can't read in a chart, what's spiritually there, what's not there. So I said, I asked Prabhupada, what about astrology? How does it fit in with Vaishnavism? Is it part of Vaishnavism? Do we use astrology? Because you can see that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's grandfather did his chart, Nilambar Chakravarti. Chart was accurate. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati also knew astrology. Bhakti Vinod also knew astrology very well. What's its validity? Should we use astrology? So Prabhupada said, he said, our Vaishnava attitude, the Vaishnava Siddhanta is, and I forget the verse now, it's Bhavatu something or other from Kulashekar Maharaj. And the Siddhanta is whatever may come, may come. We don't care, whatever may come, may come. But he said, if you know it's going to rain, it's better to have an umbrella. So he said it again, he repeated it, he said, so our philosophy is, as Kulashekar says, whatever may become by your mercy, let it come. That's our philosophy, that's our Siddhanta. But if you know it's going to rain, then it's better to take an umbrella.
But, clearly we had outgrown that building, so Govardhan had found this palatial estate that, was the Fisher Mansion that became the Bhaktivedanta Cultural Center. So we went over there to look at it, and Srila Prabhupada, of course, immediately liked it. And, he mentioned to Govardhan, he said, who would not like such a building? And Govardhan said, well, Ambarish doesn't like it, because it was dirty and there was dogs in it, and the neighborhood was really, really bad, and I couldn't see what was going to happen to it, but Prabhupada had a vision of what this place could be like. And Govardhan said, Ambarish thinks it's Maya. And so Prabhupada said, yes, but Krishna is Maya also, and Maya can be utilized in the service of Krishna. So, we ended up by purchasing the building, and, the story of how we purchased the building I think has been repeated by some other devotees, but I'll go ahead and tell it anyway. That there was a man actually who owned the building, and he had an alarm company, and we went to see him after we had looked at the building, and we were sitting out by the pool, and of course he was very materialistic and greedy. He wanted to get as much money, but the neighborhood was so bad around it that I couldn't see how he was possibly going to get. He was actually asking $350,000. So Prabhupada told the man that he liked the building, and he said, he said, of course, we're mendicants, we're monks, we don't have very much money. So then he suggested, that the man give the building. And the man seemed to be pretty cool about, he didn't seem too shocked with at least his suggestion, but the real estate lady, she almost fell over backwards in her chair because she was counting her commission, and when Prabhupada said this, her jaw like dropped, But, the man was very respectful, and he said, he couldn't possibly do that, and he had invested money in the property. So they settled upon a price, and Prabhupada asked us, if myself and Laker Shivanti, if we could come up with the money. So we ended up by purchasing the building in that way.
Yeah, Prabhupada gave me some instruction. It's interesting. At the very final pastimes, 1977 in Rishikesh, Prabhupada again decided that he would teach us how to cook. I don't know why it was, but we were all men there. Myself, Bhakti Maharaj, Yadubar, and Prabhupada decided he was going to teach us how to cook prasadam. And again, he taught me how to roll chapatis at that time. And he taught us how to cook one preparation, badi chachari, which is a Bengali prep. Prabhupada said, the way you cook this prep is you use all mustard oil. You cut up the port towels and potatoes and chilies and put them in mustard oil. Drown them in the mustard oil and then put on a very strong flame and cook them until they burn. He said, when you see it smoking and the sound comes out, fut, 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 that sound, bubbling sound, he said, then you know it is done. So when we went to Rishikesh, Bhakti Maharaj cooked this badi chachari, and Prabhupada took it and then he immediately corrected him. He complained that day. He said, it is no good. And Bhakti Maharaj was very downcast, of course. And he said, he apologized that I used too much oil. I said, no, you have not used too much oil. You did not use enough chilies. The problem is never too much oil. The problem is not enough chilies. So he wanted that there should be more chilies.
And one time Prabhupada was on a walk, and he said, so, what is the most beautiful animal? So devotees go, oh, Prabhupada, cow. Cow. I said, no. Elephant? No. It says horse. It's horse is the most beautiful animal. Devotees go, a horse. So of course the horse is the most beautiful animal. Cow is not beautiful. Cow may be sacred, but cow is not beautiful. Horse is the most beautiful animal.
I remember that we were walking in the gardens, and Prabhupada wanted to make this building a show place for Krishna consciousness. And I remember specifically that he mentioned about putting in diorama exhibitions. And he was very enthusiastic about these diorama exhibitions because actually his spiritual master, Bhakti Siddhanta, had used these diorama exhibitions for preaching when he was preaching throughout India, and they were very, very effective, a very effective way of preaching. And Prabhupada, could see that the karmis were using these, Disney was using them, and so he was enthusiastic that we should have these diorama exhibitions. So that was one of the first things that I wanted to get working on when we bought the property. And Prabhupada said, because I was concerned with the neighborhood, that because there was a lot of crime and burned out buildings, and Prabhupada had said that if you simply bring Krishna here, that everything will improve. And of course, at the time, I didn't have very much faith in it. But now, the story is well known about how the neighborhood has improved, according to Srila Prabhupada's vision. That, there's luxury condominiums there now. There's the first new housing development within the city limits of Detroit in 40 or 50 years, or is there now. The whole neighborhood has been transformed. And they have said specifically it's because the temple is there. So Prabhupada could see, he could see that this was going to happen. And, personally, what I learned from this experience was that just simply by following the instructions of the spiritual master, that you become successful. And I didn't have to, as disciples, we don't have to try to be innovative or think up new things, but just following the Prabhupada's directions, because Prabhupada could see past, present, and future because he was in touch with Krishna, and worked out. The building has worked out really well. I mean, it really has become a wonderful center. People come there that would never visit any other temple. So I think Prabhupada would be very pleased with the way things develop. He envisioned that people would come by in their boats and take prasadam, and all these things have come to pass, one way or another. So
one time we were driving to Bombay. We were staying. This is before we ever had a temple in Bombay. Really early, 1970, maybe November. And we were driving, and it was in the middle of a traffic jam. It was just going to that program of Sumati Maharaj's at Scindia House. And we went into a traffic jam, and it was horrendous fumes, In those days, there was no air-conditioned cars there or anything. Horrible. And Prabhupada got sick to his stomach. When we came back, Prabhupada lay down, and he told me that, we thought he was going to die. We thought he was going to leave his body. And we were just so fearful, and Prabhupada was he was almost unconscious. And finally Prabhupada said, "Bring me some rose water." So we brought him and poured him some rose water, mixed it in water, and Prabhupada drank it. And as soon as he drank it, within 1 or 2 minutes, he sat up and he was normal. Completely recovered.
I remember one time in 1968, Prabhupada had just finished a program at the Montreal Temple, and he was living in an apartment a couple blocks away. So he went out with his secretary, Gorsundar, and Vamandev accompanied him, carrying something, and I also went along. So we're walking along the sidewalk, and as soon as we were on the sidewalk, walking down Park Avenue, Vamandev says to Prabhupada, "Oh, so Prabhupada, that was such a great kirtan. I enjoyed it so much." Prabhupada immediately turned to him and said, "Kirtan is not for you to enjoy. It is for Krishna's pleasure. If you enjoy, then that is not kirtan." So it's a little different understanding that you chant for the pleasure of Krishna. You don't chant for your own pleasure. If you chant for your own pleasure, you're actually not doing the kirtan. You're doing what some call the Maya kirtan, not Krishna kirtan. Krishna kirtan is praising for his pleasure.
I remember one thing that he preached about was that they were spending millions and millions of dollars to build this Renaissance Center in Detroit. My uncle, Henry Ford II, had put millions of dollars into building this place to sort of revitalize the downtown area. And Prabhupada had said that that these cities will never, he said, they will never have a Renaissance, because of the influence of Kali Yuga, that, all the problems like crime and the degeneration of the cities will continue, because it was just, the atmosphere in Kali Yuga, that they would never be able to reverse this, except through Krishna consciousness. But Prabhupada used these current events and current goings-on in his preachings quite a bit. I remember that, that same year that they had a big article in Time magazine about crime, and it was the name of the article was "Crime: Why and What to Do." And Prabhupada just fixated upon this, and everywhere he went, he would preach about crime, why, and what to do, So he was always very, worldly, even though he was, totally transcendental, and detached. But he knew what was going on in the world, and he used to like to preach along these lines, so people could relate. It wasn't just. He preached that Krishna consciousness was actually a very practical solution to all problems. It wasn't just like an ancient philosophy, but actually Krishna consciousness was very current and could provide answers to all problems that were going on now. It was very relevant to today, And I think he liked to incorporate, current events into his preaching, to sort of drive home that point. But it was nice.
One time I had to go out to invite some people to come see Prabhupada. Prabhupada decided to have a Mahotsava in Mayapur. And I went to invite some people to come. And then I came back and Prabhupada said, "So what are the results? Who can come?" And I said, "Oh, such and such." I gave him the report. then I had gone to one place and I commented to Prabhupada, it's so nice there, it's so nice, so clean, so neat and clean, it's such a nice place. He said, yes, he says, it is very, they keep it very nice, very neat and clean, but such dirty hearts. So different emphasis.
I remember after we finished purchasing the new temple in Detroit, the night after the purchase was signed and completed, that the real estate lady and her partner, who were these just two middle-aged Polish women from this realtor company, came to congratulate Prabhupada, and they were both intoxicated, and they came up and they were laughing, and Prabhupada was so kind, and he was very happy too, because we had purchased this building at a pretty good price, But Prabhupada was very friendly, and he never discriminated against anybody. He always made whoever it was feel very comfortable, and personable. His attitude was so personable. It was amazing.
So when Prabhupada was leaving his body, and he wanted to go, to Gitanagari and help us in knowing how to do Varnashram Dharma. He stopped in England. By that time, I was in Eastern Europe, and we had heard that Prabhupada was coming. So we dropped everything, and we came to the manor. So when Srila Prabhupada heard that I was around, he immediately told devotees to call for me. And by that time, Prabhupada, had practically stopped all bodily functions, and devotees were carrying him, in the palanquin to have darshan. So when I came in, and it was, there was one devotee, there was Krishna, Kshetra, and a devotee, he left his body, I think his name was Dwarkadish. He used to work in Hungary and Poland and those places. So we were all together, and Tamal Krishna Maharaj was there. So Tamal had already written me many wonderful letters telling me how that I should continue sending these letters to Prabhupada as he's sick, is giving him new life. He was probably so happy to hear about the preaching, how his books were going into so many different places. And so I was sending reports about every 2 weeks. And I would be sending detailed reports. Who got the books, what was said, what was done. And Tamal would tell us how Prabhupada would hear this after taking lunch, and that after being garlanded and put chandan on him, and he would sit back, and Tamal would tell me he would close his eyes and he would swoon, etc. So Tamal was eager for me to come in, for Prabhupada to see me. So an interesting thing happened. I came in, I sat before Prabhupada's desk, and Prabhupada his voice was so weak. So he would call me, he would motion over to come closer. So then I came a little closer. And then he motioned for me to come around the desk. And then when I came around, Prabhupada started rubbing my head. And then he started crying, and then he embraced me. And then he said something which I didn't quite understand. But then what he said later, he says, your life is successful. And then I said, Prabhupada, we're only doing things because you are forcing us. Otherwise, how could we do anything? And then his voice became very strong, even though he was so weak. His body was so weak. He says, yes, and that is the parampara. My guru has forced me, and I am forcing you. And that is how things are going on. And it was so amazing. It was the most amazing experience I ever had with Srila Prabhupada. I mean, I couldn't appreciate it. And the next thing that happened shows you how I didn't appreciate it. Because it just came upon me, it was so fast. And Prabhupada was so weak, and at the same time, he was so strong and giving so much love. So the next day, now this was the very last time I saw Prabhupada. The next day, Tamal wanted me to experience what Prabhupada's mood was when he would read these reports. So he wanted me to physically come in and to read a report to Srila Prabhupada. Because he would write me these letters saying how Prabhupada says, your work he would give comments after. Tamal would read to him, and then Prabhupada would give some comments, and then Tamal would send me the comments. And they're some of the most amazing letters I've seen. And not because they're my letters, but they're some of the most amazing letters. So Tamal wanted me to experience what he was experiencing from Prabhupada. It's like Sajananda once told me, Sadananda. He had told me how once he was in the room when Prabhupada got a letter when I was in the communist countries. And Prabhupada didn't start speaking afterwards. He said, Prabhupada said, so he do not know the language. They do not know his language. He does not know their language. But the books are going out. He is a black man in different race. And the books are going. He says, and the books are going. And he says, and Prabhupada went into like a trance. He says, the books are going. And he says, Prabhupada just went out right there. And so these are the kind of things that were going on. So Tamal wanted me to experience something of what they were experiencing when Prabhupada would read the letters. So now, the day before, Prabhupada has embraced me and told me my life was successful. And 5 of the devotees were in the room. So now I'm going around kind of puffed up, you know. Prabhupada has embraced me, you know. And everybody was saying, you know, people knew me then as Ganesham. So everyone was saying, those who knew that, oh, Ganesham was embraced by Prabhupada, this and that. So I was feeling cocky, you know. Prabhupada embraced me. So the next day I came in reading my report. And the report, I think, was from our activities in Eastern Europe. And I started reading about the events of how the books had gotten out, this professor had taken, this library had accepted, this museum had accepted. And Prabhupada at one point stopped me. And he said, it is by Krishna's mercy, very piercing. He was chastising me that I was accepting, one, that I deserved his darshan, that I was feeling proud of what I had received. You know, he told me some other things in that same session about the communists, if they don't take the Krishna consciousness, they will have no grain, there will be many problems. But this one, he tuned into me and said like this. It was the very last words that Prabhupada had ever said to me, the very last time I saw him. And it just lived with me to realize that we must always remind ourselves that anything that we're able to do is by the mercy of Guru and the mercy of Krishna. So here, the best time I had with Prabhupada, most amazing experience was the day before, and the most devastating experience was the last one of this serious chastisement.
When Prabhupada asked me about the Bhagavatam, called me, he was getting a massage, and called me up and asked me, he said, so in my absence, you can complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. I said, yes, Prabhupada, I try to do that. Yes. I said, okay. Good. And I said, and if I have questions, I could ask Sridhar Maharaj. He said, yes. He said, he is the man. You can ask questions. Yes, that's okay. That's good. And I mentioned someone else too, I think. And that was the only, I wasn't actually around, I mean, I was right there, but I wasn't around Prabhupada too much in the final weeks, actually, because for the final part of the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada asked me to do the translation. So I was actually translating the verses for the final volume, and that took all my time. Because what I would do is I'd do the transliteration, I'd read all the commentaries, I'd translate the verse and do the synonyms, and then I would bring it down to him and read it to him. And then we'd hold the microphone to his lips and he would dictate the purport for that last volume. So that kept me pretty much occupied because I would have to have everything ready to read, and it would take a lot to make sure that it was right. So I had to go down and read it, and I'd go right back up to the room and work on the next verses, because if he could, anytime Prabhupada was ready to do more, I had to be ready. I mean, there was no saying, well, I'm not ready, and you know, that was it. That's Bhagavatam that people wouldn't have. So for the last weeks, that's basically what I was doing. So I was right there. I was right in the next, in the compound, but I was always translating, you know, as fast as I could.
I remember in Prabhupada's final days, it was so Pishima, you know, she always used to keep Ganga Jal because she considered herself so contaminated that wherever she would sit, when she would get up, she would sprinkle some Ganga Jal. Anywhere she would go, what she touched, she would put Ganga Jal because she considered herself so contaminated that she had to purify that place. So when Prabhupada was, you know, in his final days, she went to Prabhupada, and I was just amazed. She put her hand on Prabhupada's heart, just like a sister would do, loving sister. She put her hand on Prabhupada, and she was crying, and she put her hand on Prabhupada's heart, and she started to chant in the Shringa mantras for protecting Prabhupada. It was so touching. And then one day, Prabhupada said, just before this, Prabhupada said, you know, that she wants to cook for me. So I said, what will she cook? And he said, whatever she cooks, let her cook and serve it to me. So Kirtananda Maharaj was there, and he was like, you know, the senior person. He said, Prabhupada, you cannot eat what she cooks. She's going to cook everything in mustard oil. Prabhupada said, you know, whatever she cooks, it's all right, doesn't matter. So Pishima cooked his kachoris, which was, you know, Prabhupada was called kachori mukha, one whose, he used to be called kachori mukha, one whose mouth and face is always full of kachoris. So, you know, we brought in the kachoris, and Prabhupada, I mean, at this point, Prabhupada could only drink liquids, right? Prabhupada started eating kachoris. He ate everything she cooked. And everybody thought, that's it, you know, Prabhupada may leave his body. No, no problem. Kirtananda Maharaj left. he gave up. Because he was like, he was playing the role of like, you know, the stern doctor and like the elder. He was like a parent. And Prabhupada didn't want to be controlled. So at that point he said, no, I will eat what I want to eat. Don't try to stop me.
During the last few months of his life, you know, when I think it was actually just before he left, and I knew he was really ill, and some of the devotees were going to India, but for some reason, I just never thought that he was going to depart. I thought, you know, how can he leave? He can't leave us now. And so I did not go to India, and I'd been there for 2 months a couple of years before, and had gotten quite ill, so I wasn't anxious to go back to India, although, you know, in retrospect, I wish I had gone. But, you know, Govardhan went, and the first thing he asked when Govardhan went in, you know, Govardhan was president of Detroit, was, how is Ambarish? I mean, he was on his deathbed, I mean, his, you know, departure bed, and he was asking how I was doing, you know, and it's just amazing to me, you know, that you know, he was always so concerned, and right up until the end, he was translating and giving instruction, and everything he did for our benefit, you know, for the benefit of the living entities, you know, and especially his disciples. It's just such an example right up until the last moment, you know, of what love is. You know, I never knew what love was, you know, before I met Srila Prabhupada. I had no idea, because we get so many perverted reflections, but, you know, it's just, he was like an example of of Krishna's love, you know, which is pretty amazing, you know, that we're able to see that.
When one time we were going in Japan, Prabhupada asked me, when we were going to India, he said, if anyone challenges that I have used this name Prabhupada, he said, you should ask them, how many books have you printed? How many miles have you traveled? How many temples have you made? How many devotees have you made? He said, ask them that. He said, I should not say this. He said, but I can say it honestly. He said, I have inherited the property of my Guru Maharaj. Very strong.
Krishna Kirtana Gana Natana Pano Je Anilo